Welcome back to 21st Century Radio, and of course, congratulations to Brother George Harrison, who has moved on to another round of the spirit world. All of us are obviously going to miss him, but we know he's a hell of a lot happier now than he ever has been. We'll see you later, Brother George. Of course, in my opinion, there's no doubt that George Harrison was the spiritual leader of what we knew as the Beatles. Yes, this is 21st Century Radio. I'm Dr. Bob Hieronymus, a lowly Ph.D., but still, I'm still qualified to talk anyway. I can still drive cabs and work in restaurants, as many of my friends up there in Boston with their Ph.D.s are doing. And, of course, this is not the best show on the earth. Indeed, it is what we used to call the Zoe Show, but actually it's Future Talk with Zoe. Of course, if you don't know how to listen to her during the day, every day, all you need to do is call 410-356-4852, and they'll tell you how to do it. Our executive producer and research assistant and the editor of the Yellow Submarine book, which is due out by the end of January, beginning of February, we understand, 432 pages, 27 years of my life, and I'm very happy to say goodbye to that part of my life. Well, J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and Silmarillion have long been recognized as among the most popular fiction of the 20th century, and most critical analysis of Tolkien has centered on these novels. Granted access by the Tolkien estate and the Bodleian Library in Oxford to Tolkien's unpublished writings, Dr. Verlyn Flieger uses them to shed new light on his better-known works, revealing a new dimension of his fictive vision and giving added depth of meaning to his writing. Analyzing Tolkien's treatment of time. We've done that a billion times here on 21st Century Radio, but in a different way. And time travel, certainly we've covered that, maybe about 72 hours in these past 14 years. Dr. Flieger shows that he was not just a myth maker and writer of escapist fantasy, but a man whose relationship to his own century was troubled and critical. I bet you we all feel a lot like that, and I certainly did. Now, he achieved in his fiction a double perspective of time that enabled him to see in the mirror of the past the clouded reflection of the present. Dr. Verlyn Flieger, Ph.D., is a specialist in myth studies and comparative mythology. She teaches a sequence of graduate and undergraduate myth courses which offer Celtic myth, Arthurian myth, Hindu myth, Native American myth, and Norse myth. Dr. Flieger also lectures on myth to a wide variety of groups. Welcome back to 21st Century Radio, Dr. Verlyn Flieger.
Thank you.
Boy, my heavens, it's been 7 years.
Has it been that long?
7 years. You first joined us in 91. I think you returned again in 93 or 94.
Yes, I remember.
Isn't that something? Well, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
I've really enjoyed your work, as I always do. Now, Tom Shippey, in his most recent book on J.R.R. Tolkien, refers to Tolkien as the author of the century. Is Tolkien truly the author of this century, in your opinion?
Yes, he certainly is. No question about it. I would agree with that 100%.
Well, why is that? Why is he?
Well, first of all, for one of the reasons that Tom gives in his book, the sheer sales figures. That book, The Lord of the Rings, and also The Hobbit, have been in print continuously since they first appeared, and have been steady bestsellers. There are also the polls, 4 or 5 polls in Great Britain, which showed, readers' polls showed The Lord of the Rings as the top of a list of 100 books or so.
Holy heavens.
Estimation of their readers. But I think also because it really speaks to the century about the things that concerned it most deeply, about war, about the place of small people in a big world, about difficult moral decisions that have to be made on not enough information, all of those things. And also because he really set the seal on a kind of genre of heroic fantasy that has become very popular.
It sure has.
He was published.
Mm-hmm. Well, the subtitle of your book, A Question in Time, is J.R.R. Tolkien's Road to Faerie. I'll say that again almost correctly. The J.R.R. Tolkien's Road to Faerie. What is meant by the word fairy?
Well, he said that fairy is the realm or state in which fairies have their being, but that's a sort of shorthand way for him to talk about something that he really felt was very, very difficult to define, although not to describe. And I think by it he meant a state of enchantment, largely brought about for him through words. It's the state of secondary enchantment that you get into when you read a fairy tale. And he meant by that the suspension of disbelief that we all have, the desire for wonder and marvels, a kind of altered state, really.
Well, I learn so many things every time I read your work, and I was really not too familiar with J.W. Dunn, but certainly after I finished your work, I was a little bit familiar with J.W. Dunn. Who was he, and why would Tolkien want to illustrate his theory on time?
J.W. Dunn was actually an aeronautical engineer, and he designed the first military airplane. But that is not why he is remembered, if he is at all, but because he wrote a book in 1927 called An Experiment with Time, which actually became very, very popular with a number of British writers of that period. It had to do with what he saw as the limitations of our waking consciousness, which could be overcome if we so desired, enabling us to move not only forward but backwards through time. And that book influenced, British writers like J.B. Priestley, Rumer Godden, James Hilton, E.R. Edison, Charles Williams, a whole generation of imaginative British writers writing in the 30s and 40s.
Well, sometimes I don't feel like I'm living in the right time at all, Dr. Flieger. I really don't.
I sympathize.
And every time I read about, say, the group called the Inklings, and in your book you mentioned a number of other groups, earlier groups before the Inklings that that Tolkien spent time with. I just felt that would be a delightful way to live, to sit around and read to others and have them read their works. It seems so civilized. But today, I guess the TV outranks everything in different ways.
Yes.
Yeah. So what was the ideal mechanism that J.R.R. Tolkien found in Dunn's work, An Experiment with Time, by which to effect time travel without magic or machinery?
Well, it was actually a very simple one. It was a mechanism that we're all quite familiar with, and that is the mechanism of dreams. Dunn had decided, or had proved to his own satisfaction through experiments, that the dreaming mind can free itself of the constraints of linear forward time and move both forward and backward. And Tolkien was engaged in writing a time travel story and didn't want to use any of the usual mechanisms or gimmicks. He was violently critical of H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, not for its imaginative time travel itself, but for the mechanism by which Wells' traveler traveled through time, which was a machine, and Tolkien thought that was a kind of bogus way to do it. It didn't really work. So he was looking for another way to get his heroes able to travel in time or through time. And he read Dunn's book and realized that dream and the processes of the dreaming mind could carry the dreamer back through time into another period. And that was the mechanism that he decided to use, so that he didn't have to bother with machinery or with any kind of magic which he felt might not be believed. Everybody dreams. And so he thought that would be a pretty neat way to do it.
Well, obviously we all do dream, as you noted, and there are so many. Oh my goodness, I don't know how many authors we've reviewed that spent a lot of time studying the importance of dream to our consciousness, dreams to our well-being, etc., etc., etc. But I believe, as you note, that within the literature of fantasy and mythology, etc., dreams have always been an important element in that area, haven't they?
Well, yes, there's certainly always been prophetic dreams. Moses dreamed interpreted a couple of dreams for Pharaoh that were prophetic. That, got him a job.
Mm-hmm. That's on his job resume. I do dreams.
Right, yes, interpreter of dreams.
Well, he certainly would do well today. There's an awful lot of interpreting of dreams, but of course there are some groups like the Committee for the Scientific, was it PsyCop, and I can't remember the rest of their name. I think I got a block here, who actually almost made the attempt to not outlaw, but certainly put down any interpretation of any dream, because they felt that this was not the way to go. Dreams were just a bit of bad. What would you call it when you're trying to digest your food? Things along those lines. I guess kind of like...
indigestion?
Indigestion,
sounds kind of like Scrooge.
Yes, I know. Well, they do sound like kind of like Scrooge, don't they? I mean, many of the members of PsyCop that I used to know anyway. Dreams were just not that important. They were just accidental. And yet there's a whole literature that points to the fact that... Not the fact, but there's a whole literature that suggests that dreams are important to our mental and emotional health.
I agree.
Yeah.
No question about that.
It's a good thing I don't do all the kind of things I have in my dreams.
Well, I don't know whether Tolkien ever had the kind of dreams himself that Dunn described, but he certainly found in them a way to get his fictional characters to move from one level of time to another.
But when we return, I'm going to ask you about the difference between Tolkien and Dunn's take on time. I think you touched on that, but I don't think we got into enough detail on that, okay?
Surely.
Well, when we return with Dr. Verlyn Flieger, we'll be reviewing, of course, an important work called A Question of Time, J.R.R. Tolkien's Road to Faerie, Kent State University Press, www.mythus.com, www.mythus.com.
John Anthony West, author of Serpent in the Sky, High Wisdom of Ancient Egypt, and the leader of Magical Egypt Tours to Egypt. You're listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronymus.
At that, he woke up with a horrible start and found that part of his dream was true. A crack had opened at the back of the cave and was already a wide passage. He was just in time to see the last of the ponies disappearing into it.
The ponies! Help! Goblins!
Welcome back to 21st Century Radio with our guest, Dr. Verlyn Flieger, with the book A Question of Time. J.R.R. Tolkien's Road to Faerie, Kent State University Press. Get a couple of copies of this book. Everyone loves Tolkien. I didn't realize just how popular J.R.R. Tolkien was. My heavens. www.mythus.com. I remember when we discovered him back there in the 60s, the early 60s. I loved it because there were very few other people that I knew that were studying him at that time. But obviously I must have been on a different planet altogether. Now, so we find that J.R.R. Tolkien uses dreams, or the dreaming process, to understand the time element, and And one of his influences, I don't know if should we say J.W. Dunn was one of his influences, Dr. Flieger?
Oh, I think so, yes.
Okay. One of his influences, what I mean by that is I didn't think that Tolkien just studied him and then based his work on J.W. Dunn. That's what I meant by that. But Tolkien's views in this area were slightly different than Dunn's work, Experiment with Time. How's that? What was the difference between Tolkien and Dunn on this particular project?
Well, as Dunn wrote about it, and of course he was promoting his own theory, he suggested that it was very easy to do. That all you had to do was sort of turn off your waking mind, and which he called Observer 1, and pay attention to your dreaming mind, which he called Observer 2, who was a little bigger than Observer 1 and had a greater field of vision, and then you could move into Observer 2's larger field of vision and move across time as you would move across space. And Tolkien wasn't quite happy with that being so easy to do. I think he wanted something that would be a little more difficult so that not everybody would do it. And so he decided that it should be something that was not necessarily available to everyone, that it was given to selected individuals and largely as an exception to a rule, where for Dunn it was more a question of habit. We were in the habit of thinking of time as moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
But we can break that habit if we want to.
Yeah, it's not a law.
It's not a law.
Yeah. Now, Tolkien made a bargain with C.S. Lewis, which I found fascinating. For some reason, years ago, I may have read this, but totally forgot about it. He made a bargain with C.S. Lewis. What was it in regards to writing about time?
Well, as you know, they were great friends. They were also colleagues at Oxford, and did meet and read their work to one another. And Tolkien mentions this bargain several times in his letters. He quotes Lewis as saying to him one day that there's not nearly enough of what they both like to read in stories, and so they would have to write it themselves. And they sort of flipped a coin, and one of them took space travel, that was Lewis, who wrote his space trilogy then, and the other took time travel, that was Tolkien, and he began to write a time travel story. He never finished his story, and Lewis finished his and went on to write a trilogy. So Lewis had, I guess, the best of that bargain.
Yeah, I guess so. But Tolkien did start. I think you mentioned 3 or 4 chapters. He had 3 or 4 chapters finished of not on the road. Gosh, I got it mixed up. Yeah, I almost got him mixed up with Jack Kerouac, and I don't think I was exactly. They're not exactly thinking along the same lines there. So he completed like about 4 chapters, and then decided.
Yes, he wrote 4 chapters of what he had planned to be his time travel story, in which he began with a father and son, both of a rather scholarly persuasion, who dream, and in their dreams seem to move around in time and to remember things that they can't with their waking minds. Chiefly, they remember language, and he got about 4 chapters of that and then abandoned it because he was also in the process of publishing The Hobbit and then beginning to work on The Lord of the Rings. He started The Lost Road in about 1936, but then also was working on the publication of The Hobbit, which came out in 1937. So he kind of put that on a back burner and didn't come back to the idea until he reached a kind of stopping place in The Lord of the Rings where he felt he wasn't getting very far. And he sat down to write the whole thing again. This time he brought the scene up to Oxford, to his own sort of milieu, to the colleges, and made the time travelers not a father and son, but a group of collegial and interested scholars, rather like the Inklings, who discussed time travel and time travel books and criticized various ways of moving through time. And he he got a good deal farther on with this second attempt, which was called the Notion Club Papers. Notion, I think, being a sort of code word for inkling, which was his own Oxford group. But then that, too, petered out or reached a place where he didn't know where to go with it, and he returned to the Lord of the Rings and never finished it.
Well, the things that I learned that I enjoyed so much was you had access to material that I would say most individuals that write about J.R.R. Tolkien don't have.
I was fortunate enough to get the permission of the Tolkien estate to look at some papers, yes.
That is no easy feat. I'm certain that maybe it would have been easy for you, but I know others who have attempted that and unfortunately couldn't. And that is what I enjoyed reading about, how the access that you had to those earlier works, you were able to see how this theme of the Lord of the Rings evolved, and where he was strong and what was weak, and how he moved these things around. That must have been an extraordinary experience to actually hold the same paper. Now, this is going to sound silly, isn't it? But to me, to hold the same papers, to read, so to speak, in between the lines of how something evolved, must have been absolutely thrilling, Verlyn.
Yes, it was.
I mean,
it was tremendously thrilling and moving and exciting.
Well, I bet. Now, I want to ask you a silly question, and you don't have to answer if you want. Did you ever feel when you were doing that process that perhaps maybe J.R.R. may have been looking over your shoulder?
If I had, I would have dropped the pages immediately and scuttled away in fright.
You really think so? You really think so?
I think if I had had any notion that he was watching my research, I would have been so awed I wouldn't have been able to continue.
Yeah, I guess that would be almost the same thing with some people when the Beatles walk into the room. They just can't think. I'm certain you've read stories like that. Well, this guy George Harrison walked in the room, and all of a sudden everything left me. My memory left me. I didn't know how to act. I didn't know how to talk. But obviously, with J.R.R. Tolkien, that must have been some experience to touch the papers he did, and to know a little bit more in depth as to where those stories were moving and how they were doing that. Now, again, let's go back to time travel. Exactly how did Tolkien envision time travel?
Well, he envisioned, by way of J.W. Dunn, the second observer, Observer 2, who is a larger consciousness than Observer 1, and sees a greater field of time, and he envisioned that observer as being his sort of overarching consciousness to which his time travelers can get access in their dreams.
Mm-hmm.
And so what he actually had planned was a whole sequence of moves back through time, not just from one time directly to another time and stay there, but a movement of consciousness back from the present through various periods of English history. And he had jotted down a number of notes about where he wanted his time travelers to go, into actual episodes out of British history and myth, and then back into the Ice Age, and then eventually back into his own mythology, where they were to connect with the overarching Observer 2 consciousness.
Well,
it sounds fearfully complicated, but in actuality, it works out to be very, very simple.
Well, you know, as you note in page 87, because this is something I went over again and again in my mind and tried to differentiate what J.W. Dunn was doing in relationship to Tolkien. The operational principle of Dunn's theory, which provides for the dream to free the dreamer's awareness and enable it to move freely over the field of time. Yes. Observer 2 can go anywhere for any length of time, while observer 1 sleeps on, fixed in one place, and caught in one time. And so J.R.R. went to observer, well, his work was then centered around observer 2. Am I correct?
That's right.
Well, that's quite a leap.
It is.
It is, and you know, so in a certain sense, he was, well, he was being more specific, I think, than J.W. Dunn. Is that possible?
Probably not more specific. J.W. Dunn's book, as with many books written by engineers, tends to be extremely specific, specific that you can get lost in it. But what Tolkien was doing was to turn theory into imaginative art, and to show it in action, to show it in motion, rather than simply to lay out a theory about it.
Well, see, that's my difficulty in not having read his book.
Well,
I mean, because it does make a difference.
It's out of print. Oddly enough, it was in print for quite a while. In the 30s, it went through 3 editions. Tolkien had the 3rd edition. And you can still pick it up in secondhand bookstores from time to time.
For about $1.98?
Yeah.
Oh, really? I was kidding. Really?
No, it's not a rare book. And it's not one that many people now are interested in. I got my copy at School Books in Bloomsbury, London, and I think I paid about £2 for it.
Oh, my heavens. But I'm sure that when others...
No, I'm looking at the price. I paid £4.50.
Oh, I thought you paid a little bit more than that.
Still pretty cheap.
I know. What books can you buy for, what's that, 4 times $1.60? Somewhere around $7 or $8. You don't find many books these days.
Still isn't bad.
No, it's pretty good. Well, we're going to take another break here on 21st Century Radio, our second and final of the hour. When we return, we'll talk about Elfwine and how...
Winna.
Pardon me?
Elfwine.
I'm sorry, Elfwine.
Yes, it's Anglo-Saxon. How would you know?
How would I know? I'm just an artist anyway. Now, we'll return with our guest, Dr. Verlyn Flieger. This is a great book, friends. I learned so much from it, and what I also learned was there's a lot that I didn't know at all, and never even contemplated that there was this kind of depth in many different areas. But that's my problem. The book is A Question in Time, J.R.R. Tolkien's Road to Faerie, Kent State University Press, www.mythus.com.
Frank Joseph. I'm the editor of Ancient American Magazine, Archaeology of the Americas Before Columbus. You're listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronymus, most exciting personality in American radio.
These languages were created by Tolkien, and I think probably the most difficult thing for us is to really to adhere to his work, so that when people are disappointed, as they are likely to be, by some of the sounds and the pronunciations that they'll hear, because they've only heard them in their own heads when they've read the books, that we are able to at least produce something which is authentic and true to Tolkien's work. That's the most difficult thing, I think.
Well, thank you, Andrew Jackson. That's not the President of the United States, but... concerning dialogue and language. He was the dialogue and language coach of the new film, which will be coming out, I believe it's December the 19th. We'll be taking a look at it on December the 8th, I believe. That's when we take a look at it. We're very excited, obviously. And Richard Taylor of WETA, who worked with Mr. Jackson, Andrew Jackson, and was worked on all the visual effects, will be joining us also, I believe, whenever my boss tells me. That's Dr. Laura Kortner in there. Now, our guest presently is Dr. Verlyn Flieger. The book is A Question of Time, J.R.R. Tolkien's Road to Faerie, Kent State University Press, www.mythus.com. Mythus, mythus.com. And I was interested in what Dr. Jackson had to say. We're giving away Ph.D.s today, friends. It only costs $100. All you do is send in, and we'll send you one. Won't mean anything, but we used to give away Rocky and Bullwinkle Ph.D.s. But Mr. Jackson made some interesting points there, and it was one of the reasons why I've become so involved in trying to listen now, because when you read the books without any background in the language, you mispronounce a number of words. Now, I'm sure that our guest, Dr. Verlyn Flieger, has never had that problem, but I have had that problem all the time, because I see the words and I'm mispronouncing them, so when someone talks to me about them, Dr. Flieger, sometimes I don't recognize them.
I don't either.
Well, what? Now I feel a lot better. Now, and once again, I'm now trying to pronounce this name again, Ælfwine?
Ælfwine.
Winna. Oh, I'm sorry. But who is Ælfwine, and how does this relate to the Lord of the Rings?
Well, Ælfwine is an Anglo-Saxon proper name. It's a word compound, and it means elf friend, from elf, and winna, which is Anglo-Saxon for friend or lover. Tolkien had a character called Ælfwine, whom he at one point envisioned as being this sort of overarching consciousness who would be able to survey the whole field of time, and through whose consciousness his time travelers would move. And they were all given names which were some form of Ælfwine. Alboin, which is the modern sort of British version of Ælfwine. One of them was in his own language and was called, I think, Herondil. But even if they didn't have the proper name Ælfwine, he's got, throughout his story, and people who have read The Lord of the Rings are bound to recognize this, a lot of people who are described as elf friends. Mm-hmm. Frodo, Baggins, is called an elf friend several times during the story.
Certainly. Was Bilbo was an elf friend too, wasn't he?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Now, elves were, would you say they're immortal? Except, of course, they can die if you're shooting them and stuff.
Yes, elves are immortal, but they don't have eternal life. Mm-hmm. They just have serial longevity, is the word that Tolkien used.
Yes,
they must live for as long as the world endures, and if they are killed, they have to come back. They come back as another elf? As the same elf.
As the same elf?
Well, it's a little difficult, and he never quite worked it out. But it was a kind of imaginative version of reincarnation.
Ah, yes. A lot of people would love to be immortal for all kinds of reasons, but Lorien is a refuge from linear time, an island where the past somehow exists in the present. Now, there are downsides to living in Lorien, in such a wondrous place. What might they be?
Well, one of them is that you're not in the present. You're not of the present. You are in time that has stopped in a particular moment for whatever reason, for its beauty or its preciousness to you. But that means that you are, in Tolkien's words, a kind of embalmer of time. You don't want to let it go. You don't want to let it move. You don't trust change. Mm-hmm. And Lorien, for all its beauty, and I love it dearly, is a place where time has paused and has resisted the inevitable decay that time affects on all the rest of us.
Well, that would mean, of course, as you note, when the leaves start falling on the ground, they don't deteriorate in any way. They don't mix themselves back into the soil, but just stay on the ground. Is that how that works?
Apparently so. Now, he never got down to the actual practice of it, but Lorien is a place which is described as looking like spring in winter.
Looking like spring and winter.
Yeah.
Oh. Well, I think, as you note, the Lord of the Rings is mainly concerned with death and immortality and the escapes. Now, you've already mentioned serial longevity and hoarding memory as one of the others. Could we go into some more detail about these escapes of serial longevity and hoarding memory and what they might mean?
Yeah. How much time have you got?
Well, we've got about almost 7.5 minutes, but we can give it a start.
Okay, then very quickly. In his essay on fairy stories, Tolkien talks about Faerie and fantasy as offering a number of escapes from the present world. Escape from time and space, the ability to fly or the ability to travel through time. But there was also what he called the great escape, which is the escape from death. And if you think of your favorite fairy stories, many of them end with the awakening or the renewal or the escape from apparent death of Sleeping Beauty or Cinderella or Snow White or whoever. But then he said, doubtless the human stories of the elves are filled with the escape from deathlessness, that they might become weary of a perpetual existence in time and wish to escape it. And in The Lord of the Rings and in the Silmarillion, what he was doing, among many, many other things, was exploring the relative values of death and deathlessness, the ability to let go when your time is up. After all, if you think about The Lord of the Rings, it's all about being able to give up the ring. And that becomes a sort of metaphor for what Tolkien felt was not the ideal, but the desired human condition. We really have no choice, which is to let go and to trust.
Well, before we get into a little bit more detail on the ability to let go, because there seems to be a number of things that need to be let go of, not just the ring, but I guess immortality and mortality and the advantages and disadvantages. But the hoarding memory of this, could you be more specific about that, or maybe I missed that when you mentioned it?
I think he simply meant that that through memory we can try to retain some notion of past time and hold on to it, which is what is happening in Lorien. They are hoarding their time. They are holding on to it as if it were some kind of treasure, rather than being able to let it go. Now, it has good and bad aspects because they have long memories. They have a notion of the history of Middle-earth which is much greater than the hobbits, and are able to see a greater perspective in time than they are. But at the same time, they're trying to hold on to those memories and not let them go.
Well, it certainly tells us a lot about ourselves today. That's why I think Tolkien's work is so wondrous.
I agree.
You know, it's not only, I'm going to over-exaggerate here, friends. I've never done that in my life before. But it's kind of universal. And it goes on, well, not just with all peoples, but all times. These are patterns, perhaps. Maybe if we spent more time with the work of some psychologists, such as Jung and et cetera, we get a better perspective on this, but we don't have time for that. Now, back to the ability to let go. So the ability to let go has, concerning immortality, is also important, because if Tolkien is successful, not Tolkien, I'm sorry, but if Frodo is successful, and the good guys, let's put it that way, the good guys are successful, and the ring is destroyed, and Frodo had the ability to let go, and thank heavens Gollum was there to help him along there.
Thank goodness.
Yeah, or who knows what might have happened. And so it's not just letting go of a ring and the physical things, but letting go of immortality. That would be pretty tough, I would believe, for well, how do I know about elves? I mean, but wouldn't
Right,
that be
how does
tough?
any of us
Because that
know?
means that's the end of their world.
But he wanted to imagine it. He really wanted to imagine what it would be like to live perpetually. Would you get tired? Would you get jaded? Would you get disillusioned with all that you saw going on? Would you want to rest? And he contrasted his immortal elves with his mortal men, the humans. In his cosmology, which you don't really get when you're reading The Lord of the Rings, you have to go to the Silmarillion.
Yeah.
He makes his creator figure, Eru, bestow death as a gift on men.
And, of course, in our present-day state of consciousness, that might not seem like such a great gift, if not understood from another perspective. In your epilogue, you note that Tolkien's gift was of glee. What do you mean by that?
Well, glee is an old word. It means song and music.
Oh.
The gleeman was the minstrel, was the singer. So it doesn't just mean joy, although I think he was quite aware that it had a number of meanings. But it means the deep kind of joy that song brings. And song, of course, is chanting or chanting in French, and thus is enchantment, and enchantment is Faerie, and so his whole concept kind of comes full circle and rounds on itself.
Well, with the few seconds we got left, I got to ask you this question. Have you read the works of J.K. Rowling on Harry Potter?
Yes.
What's your assessment of their importance?
I think they're very important in that children are reading them like mad and finding them fascinating. I don't know how important they are in the overall scheme of things, because I think Rowling is writing for her own generation and doing a very good job of it.
Well, we have to go. You've done a very good job of it in this work. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Verlyn Flieger. A Question of Time, J.R.R. Tolkien's Road to Faerie, www.mythos.com. When we return, Dr. Stanley McDaniel, The Philosophical Etymology of Hobbit. You need this to do your research on.